What if Meghan Markle didn't leave her first husband because the marriage failed, but because he knew something she couldn't afford the world to hear? Not later. Not after the palace. Before any of that. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question alone changes everything. Because for years, the story has been simple, clean, almost boring. Meghan outgrew Trevor Engelson. She moved on. End of chapter. But according to whispers now tied to her own mother, Doria Ragland, that version may be missing the most important detail of all. Fear. Not heartbreak. Not incompatibility. Fear. Imagine this for a moment. You're still unknown. Still trying. Still building a future you believe you deserve. And someone beside you doesn't just know who you are now, they know who you were. The choices you made. The people you leaned on. The stories you've already told that don't quite line up. That was Trevor Engelson's position. He didn't meet a duchess. He met a woman in the trenches of Hollywood. Auditions. Rejections. Reinvention. He was there before the polish, before the talking points, before the carefully constructed image the world would later accept without question. And here's where Doria's hints matter. Because she didn't come out swinging. She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She implied. She suggested. She framed Meghan not as cold, but as scared. Scared that someone from her past held pieces of her story that no longer fit the future she was racing toward. Ask yourself this. Who in your life knows the version of you that never makes it to Instagram? Who remembers the messy drafts before the final edit? Doria's alleged comments suggest Meghan believed Trevor knew too much. About her early Hollywood years. About private family dynamics. About moments that, taken out of context, could be twisted, questioned, or used to challenge the narrative she needed the world to accept. And that's the key word here. Narrative. Because in the public eye, stories are currency. Control is power. And silence can be survival. This story matters now because people are finally looking backward instead of being distracted by what came after. They're asking why the divorce was so fast, so clean, so emotionally muted. Why there was no public mourning of a long marriage. Why Trevor never spoke, even when speaking could have brought attention, money, or leverage. Was it respect? Or was it something else entirely? Doria's hints don't accuse Trevor of blackmail, but they raise a darker possibility. That Meghan feared he could talk. And that fear alone may have been enough to end everything. Because once you believe someone has the power to rewrite your past, you don't negotiate. You cut ties. And if that's true, then the divorce wasn't the end of a love story. It was the beginning of a cover-up. But here's the part no one talks about. According to Doria, Trevor didn't just know Meghan's past. He had receipts. And once Meghan realized that, the marriage was already over. Before the palace, who Meghan was when Trevor met her. Trevor Engelson didn't meet a duchess. He met a woman still becoming herself. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when you meet someone before they've figured out who they want to be, you don't just know their dreams. You know their doubts, their contradictions, their survival strategies. And Trevor wasn't a passing boyfriend. He was there for the long nights, the quiet disappointments, the conversations that happen when no one is watching and there's no audience to impress. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Early Hollywood isn't glamorous. It's transactional. It's a maze of favors, introductions, calculated friendships, and opportunities that don't always come with clean edges. Meghan was ambitious, driven, and determined not to fade into the background. That alone isn't scandalous. It's reality. But ambition leaves fingerprints. Trevor watched her navigate auditions that went nowhere. He listened to frustrations about casting rooms and industry gatekeepers. He knew which connections mattered and which bridges were burned. He saw the early versions of stories that would later be simplified, polished, and retold. And that's where power quietly shifted. Because while the world only met Meghan when she was ready, Trevor knew her when she was still improvising. When plans changed. When narratives evolved. When the future wasn't guaranteed and image management wasn't yet a full-time job. Ask yourself something honestly. Who has more leverage in your life? The people who meet you after you succeed. Or the ones who remember how you got there? Trevor wasn't just a husband. He was an archive. He knew which stories were told differently over time. Which moments were reframed. Which parts of the past were softened, skipped, or quietly retired. And according to Doria's implied concerns, That knowledge became dangerous the moment Meghan's trajectory changed. Here's the contradiction people miss. There was no explosive breakup, no dramatic public fallout, no visible betrayal. That silence is what makes this unsettling. Because when someone truly wrongs you, anger leaks. When something far more strategic is happening, silence becomes deliberate. And Trevor stayed silent. No tell-all interviews. No bitter leaks. No desperate attempts to reclaim relevance. That raises a question no one likes to ask. Why would a man with so much proximity to a future global figure say nothing at all? Was it dignity? Was it love? Or was it an understanding between two people who both knew how damaging the truth could become if handled the wrong way? Doria's hints suggest Meghan didn't fear Trevor emotionally. She feared him historically. She feared that the man who knew her before the reinvention also knew where the seams were, where the timeline bent, where the story could unravel under pressure. And once that realization settled in, everything changed. Because when someone from your past knows the version of you that contradicts the future you're building, distance isn't optional. It's necessary. Trevor didn't just witness Meghan's early life. According to what Doria quietly suggests, he questioned it. And that question alone may have been the beginning of the end. But what turned knowledge into leverage didn't come from Trevor himself. It came from what Meghan believed he could do with it. Doria's hint, when knowledge becomes leverage. Doria Ragland never used the word blackmail. And that's exactly why people paid attention. Because when someone chooses their words carefully, it's often not to soften the truth, it's to survive it. Doria didn't accuse Trevor Engelson of making threats. She didn't paint him as a villain. Instead, she framed Meghan as a woman who felt cornered. A woman who believed someone else held pieces of her story that could be used against her, whether intentionally or not. That distinction matters. Because leverage doesn't always come from action. Sometimes it comes from possibility. Think about it. If someone knows things about you that the world doesn't, and shouldn't, they don't have to say a word to make you nervous. Their silence alone can feel like a ticking clock. And according to the way Doria allegedly spoke about this period, Meghan wasn't reacting to something Trevor did. She was reacting to what he could do. Doria's tone, as described by those who listened closely, wasn't angry. It was protective, almost cautious, as if she was walking around something sharp without naming it. That kind of caution doesn't come from gossip. It comes from fear of consequences. Here's where the story deepens. Doria reportedly suggested that Meghan began to worry that Trevor understood her past too well. Not just surface-level memories, but context, family tensions, early career decisions. Moments that, taken alone, meant nothing, but together could form a narrative Meghan didn't want told by anyone else. Ask yourself this. How many of your own stories only make sense when you're the one telling them? Now imagine someone else telling them instead. That's where leverage is born. This wasn't about scandal in the tabloid sense. It was about interpretation, about who gets to define what those early years meant. Because once Meghan's public image became more carefully curated, any alternative version, even a truthful one, became a threat. And Doria seemed to understand that instinctively. She didn't suggest Meghan was hiding crimes. She suggested Meghan was protecting continuity, protecting a clean arc from struggling actress to global figure. Protecting the idea that everything made sense, flowed logically, and was always intentional. But real lives aren't like that. They're messy. They contradict themselves. They evolve. And Trevor had lived inside that evolution. What's chilling is that there's no evidence Trevor ever tried to use what he knew. No threats. No ultimatums. No public pressure. Which raises an even more uncomfortable possibility. That the fear existed entirely on Meghan's side. That she didn't need proof of danger. She only needed uncertainty. Because once someone becomes a risk, even unintentionally, the safest move is removal. Distance. Silence. Legal finality. Doria's hints suggest that Meghan didn't wait to see if Trevor would speak. She acted before he could. Not out of malice. Out of self-preservation. And that reframes the divorce completely. Not as a breakup fueled by emotion, but as a calculated decision made under pressure. Because when knowledge becomes leverage, even without being used, trust collapses instantly. And once that happens, the marriage doesn't slowly fall apart. It ends. But here's the part that complicates everything. If Trevor never threatened Meghan, if he never hinted at exposing anything, then why did Meghan move so quickly so cleanly, and so completely. The answer to that may lie not in what Trevor said, but in what Meghan believed he might eventually say. And that belief changed everything. The divorce that wasn't emotional, it was strategic. This didn't look like a heartbreak. It looked like an extraction. No messy headlines. No public implosions. No long explanations about growing apart. Just distance. Paperwork. Finality. And that's what makes this divorce so unsettling when you look at it closely. Because when marriages end in pain, you usually see emotion leak out somewhere. A stray comment. A bitter friend. A need to be understood. None of that happened here. What happened instead was silence so complete, it almost felt rehearsed. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw someone walk away from a long marriage without trying to explain themselves? Meghan didn't rage. She didn't reminisce. She didn't publicly grieve what was lost. She moved forward as if the chapter had been sealed, boxed, and placed somewhere it could never be reopened. And Trevor? He didn't chase the spotlight either. That symmetry is important, because strategic silence is rarely accidental. According to those who have revisited the timeline, the emotional withdrawal happened before the legal one. Physical distance grew. Communication narrowed. And then suddenly, it was over. Not with a bang, but with a door closing quietly behind them. Here's the contradiction people miss. If Trevor truly felt betrayed, he held all the power afterward. He could have spoken. He could have told his side. He could have challenged the version of events that erased him from the narrative. And yet, he didn't. Why? One explanation is dignity. Another is restraint. But there's a third option no one likes to explore. That silence was mutually beneficial. Because if Trevor spoke, he wouldn't just be exposing Meghan. He'd be exposing himself. His own proximity to the past. His own role in moments that were never meant to be dissected publicly. Silence protected them both, just not equally. For Meghan, silence preserved forward momentum. For Trevor, silence preserved peace. And that suggests the divorce wasn't driven by resentment. It was driven by risk management. Think about it. When someone fears what another person knows, they don't argue. They don't negotiate emotionally. They neutralize the variable. They remove the access point. They make sure there's no ongoing relationship that could turn unpredictable. Marriage, in that sense, became a liability. And once something becomes a liability, it's handled decisively. Doria's hints fit this pattern too well to ignore. A mother watching her daughter accelerate into a new world. A mother recognizing that old attachments carry old truths. And a mother understanding that some people from your past don't fit into the future you're constructing. So the marriage ended not in chaos, but in control. And Trevor vanished from the story just as cleanly. No interviews. No revenge. No corrections. That absence has spoken louder than any accusation ever could. Because if there was nothing to protect, nothing to lose, nothing to fear, then silence wouldn't be necessary. Yet it remained. And that leaves us with one final, uncomfortable thought. If Trevor chose silence when he had every incentive to speak, what does he know that made staying quiet the safer option? Because that silence may not be loyalty. It may be containment. And if that's true, then the most dangerous secrets in this story aren't the ones that were exposed. They're the ones that never were. And that brings us to the question no one wants answered. What would happen if Trevor ever decided to talk? So here's where everything comes back together. Not with proof. Not with leaked tapes. Not with a dramatic confession. But with silence. The kind of silence that lingers long after the door has closed. From the beginning, we asked a simple but dangerous question. Did Meghan Markle leave her first husband because the marriage failed? Or because he knew a version of her past that no longer fit the future she was building? After everything we've walked through, that question feels heavier now, doesn't it? Because Doria Ragland didn't describe heartbreak. She didn't describe betrayal. She described fear. Subtle, controlled, carefully framed fear. Fear that someone from Meghan's early life understood too much. Not just facts, but context. Not just moments, but meaning. And context is powerful. Context is what turns harmless memories into inconvenient ones. Context is what makes people nervous when their life story becomes public property. Context is what separates reinvention from revision. Trevor Engelson wasn't just a husband who got left behind. He was a witness to the in-between years. The years before the image. Before the talking points. before the carefully edited origin story that the world would later accept as complete. And here's the part that should make you pause. If Trevor had nothing to lose, silence wouldn't make sense. If Meghan had nothing to fear, urgency wouldn't either. Yet we saw both. A fast, clean divorce, a total erasure from the narrative, and a man who never cashed in on the most valuable thing he possessed, proximity. That tells us something. This wasn't about love dying slowly. It was about control being regained quickly. Meghan didn't wait for trouble. According to what Doria hinted, she acted before uncertainty could become exposure. She chose finality over risk. And once the decision was made, the past was sealed off like a room no one was allowed to enter again. But rooms like that don't disappear. They just stay locked. And locked rooms make people curious. Which is why this story still matters now. Not because Trevor has spoken, but because he hasn't. Not because accusations were made, but because implications were carefully left hanging in the air. Ask yourself this. Have you ever stayed quiet not because you were wrong, but because speaking would complicate everything? That's the tension at the heart of this story. Not guilt, not innocence, but mutual containment. A shared understanding that some truths, once released, don't just hurt one person. They ripple outward. They challenge timelines. They force uncomfortable questions. And they take control away from the people who believe they've already moved on. So when people ask whether this divorce was about love,